friends, and welcome to September's reading wrap-up. Today we're going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of September, but before we get to the books, let's do a bit of nerdy stuff. Let's talk some math. Let's talk about the stats. This month I read 27 books, which is the most amount of books that I have read in a single month. This year, March was my previous best with 25 books, I think. However, like March, September has been a little bit different in terms of what I've been reading, and that count, the 27 books, is sort of artificially inflated by the fact that 16 of those books come from the Timelord fairy tales. This is a sweet little box set that I got for my 30th birthday from my oldest and dearest friend, Sarah. And it is technically like a collection of short stories, but they all are individual books. And I asked on Instagram whether you guys thought I should count them as one singular book or whether each individual book counted as an individual book. And overwhelmingly, you guys did vote in favor of counting each individual one. So hence the inflated 16 books coming from the Timelord fairy tale series. This collection is a little bit gimmicky. It's definitely like a novelty media tie-in. So even though I really enjoyed the whole experience of reading them, overall their rating wasn't super high, or at least most of them weren't. So that has kind of also skewed my overall rating for the month. It's like a pretty average 3.41. So I think that makes my reading month seem less successful and enjoyable than it has felt to me, because 7 of the books that I read have gotten 4 or more stars. So I've read a lot of stuff that I've loved. It really was the Timelord fairy tales, with me ranking each individual story, that sort of did bring down the overall rating a little bit. As for the types of books that I read 22 fiction, 2 non-fiction, and 3 manga. So no poetry this month. Then in terms of the format, I read 26 in physical copy and just 1 audiobook. But those are our big stats. If there's other stats that you would be interested in hearing in future videos, let me know and I'll see what I can do. But for now, that's all I've got for you this month. Let's dive into talking about the books. So let's start with the 2 stars. This was by far my least favorite read of the month. This was The Eye of the Sheep by Sofie Laguna. This came to me via the Wild Book Box, so if you've seen that vlog of me reading, you already know my feelings. This is an Australian fiction from a couple of years ago, and it won the Miles Franklin. It was kind of a big deal, and it is essentially the story of a young boy named Jimmy who is a little bit different. And it's never specified if Jimmy has a particular diagnosis or whatever, but Jimmy is not neurotypical. He sees the world a little bit differently, and he interacts with the world a little bit differently. He lives with his older brother, his mum, and his dad is an alcoholic and abusive, which seems to be quite a common theme in Australian novels, and I'm a little bit over it. This really is just the story of Jimmy and his family and how his father's alcoholism and abuse impacts all of them, and Jimmy in particular finds it very hard to sort of deal with that. Of course, any child would, but Jimmy very much relies on his mother for a sense of comfort and of managing his emotions, which can kind of get away from him quite quickly. Jimmy in particular, and the way that he expressed his understanding of the world, was very interesting and quite beautiful to read. I said in the vlog, and I will say it again, that I don't have the sort of lived experience that Jimmy does, so I don't want to speak to like how appropriate or accurate that representation is, but from a reading perspective, it was beautiful to read. However, the story overall wasn't very interesting to me, wasn't very engaging. The characters pretty much all felt very one-dimensional. Jimmy was the most fleshed out, but even he didn't always feel, I don't know that his characterization really went beyond his neurodivergence enough. Other people in the story felt very one-dimensional. Jimmy's mother in particular, I hated the way she was depicted and spoken about. Basically, she was a caring mum who was abused by her husband, and also she was fat. Like, that's all we know about her, that's all that's important about her. And as I said in the vlog, her body size and her weight was referenced constantly. Every time she was on the page, somehow her body was described as wide or large, or her big arms. Like, it was constant, and it just stood out to me so much because like no other character trait for any character was focused on in that way. So the characters felt very one-dimensional. The focus on like one specific physical trait of the mother felt completely unnecessary. Parts of it also just felt very unrealistic, and I don't really like the ending. But now that I've ranted about that, let's talk about the 3-star books. So I'm going to talk about the Timelord fairy tales. Overall, across all 16 stories, they were an average of 3, so I thought we could just talk about them all here. Now, I've been eyeing off this box set for a while, and I, in my head, sort of imagined this to be like the fairy tale series that the Doctor might have had on their shelf when they were a child, you know? Sort of like the fairy tales that Time Lords would have been telling their children. And some of them do read that way, and they tended to be the ones that I enjoyed more. However, there were a few in which the Doctor actually was featured, and I think I liked those less. Even though it was sort of fun having the Doctor, it felt very like fan servicey, and it sort of took away from the idea that I had about the fairy tales. And like, I understand Timelord, like it's literally time travel. Maybe the Doctor is in their own fairy tales. I don't know. I guess the ones that involved the Doctor, they ended up feeling more like drafts for a Doctor Who episode, if that makes sense, like a Doctor Who light episode, as opposed to a standalone fairy tale that would fit within the Time Lord universe. And to be fair, some were more effective than others, but basically this is just 16 fairy tales that like we know and love, but just they've got the Doctor Who twist on them. So instead of the big bad wolf, it's probably an alien. We had the Weeping Angels, we had the Centauran, we had the Slovene. The Garden of Statues was one of my favourite, and it certainly evoked, like the very first episode, we meet the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who. It definitely evoked that sort of spooky feeling really well. I also really liked the Grief Collector. That one just felt really quite beautiful and moving. Jack and the Wormhole was super fun. And then I also really liked Endiba and the Four Slovene and the Twins in the Wood. A couple only got 2 stars from me, like the Frozen Beauty. I didn't really like that one. And Cinderella and the Magic Box was basically just the 11th Doctor come to save the day. So as individual stories, it was definitely a mixed bag, but overall as a big Whovian, it was just really fun to read. They were all really quick and easy to read, and it was just a good time. And this little box set is just adorable. These little books, oh, they're just super, super cute. I love it. And now this month I did also finish Goodnight Punpun finally. So I gave 3 stars to volume 5. Now this is a bit of a tricky thing to talk about because obviously there is 4 volumes before this one, and I don't want to spoil all 4 of those for you. But I will say that the first volume of Punpun I read back in March, I loved. It was one of my favourite things that I read in March. Goodnight Punpun basically follows Punpun for a good chunk of his life. Like, we meet him, I don't know, when he was about 10, I think, from memory. And we jump kind of a couple of years in between each volume. So we get a good spread of Punpun's life. And it's this really quite dark, pessimistic take on humanity and modern life in a lot of ways. It's also quite absurd in terms of how Punpun like sees himself and his identity. And a big string through this is Punpun's relationship / obsession with a girl. But by volume 4, I definitely started enjoying Punpun a lot less. Volume 5, I started to kind of get a little bit more invested again. And as always, Inio Asano's work, like just the art is incredible. It's absolutely stunning. I think it's probably the most beautiful art that I've seen in a manga, or it's definitely up there with like Children of the Whales and stuff. Now for our 3.5 star books. And the first one I'll talk about is Goodnight Punpun Volume 6. So I was starting to enjoy it a lot more, although boy, did this story get dark. I had the sense back at Volume 1, I think I even said in that vlog that I loved it and it was quite funny, but it has this really dark undertone. Maybe not even undertone is the right word. Like, it's very dark, and I had the sense that it was just going to get more and more dark. And in Volume 6, like, it's pretty fucked up, friends. And things don't happen the way I, as the reader, wanted them to, but it made sense, and all the decisions Punpun and the people around him were making made sense to their characters. And this one, more than any other, I think really dived into the Punpun's identity and how he sees himself, and how for him it's not very fixed. And I think that's a result of his own trauma and family life that we've read about in Volume 1 and 2. But I think there is also that element of just being like a young person in the modern world is confusing as fuck. And that's what Punpun really captures for me in so many ways. It's just like how difficult it is growing up and figuring yourself out when there's so much stuff going on around you that's really messed up and traumatizing and difficult. Even if it's not like traumatizing in the way that we think of like war or anything, just like modern life itself can be really harmful to people and to people's sense of self and value and worth. To Speak for the Trees by Diana Beresford-Kroeger was September's Blossom Book Club book, so the book club that I host over on my Patreon and Discord. This was a book that we read together last month. And for me, this was a very nice read. It was very relaxing. It's basically Diana's memoir in a lot of ways, but it sort of goes beyond that. She's basically telling us the story from when she was growing up and she lost both her parents in a very short period of time. She grew up very privileged, but then obviously losing both her parents kind of changed her life. During the summers of her childhood from this point on, she spends in Ireland, where her mother is from, and she develops a very strong connection with the land, and the people around her basically sort of take her under their wing and teach her their ways, their old Celtic ways. So that's a mix of like folklore and storytelling, but also of like the incredible knowledge about, you know, the medicinal purposes of different plants, for example. As she gets older, she kind of starts excelling at school and goes on to become like a really successful scientist. And so her career in large part has been validating what she had learnt as a child from like the Celtic tradition, and also then expanding upon it. And so she becomes like an environmentalist and super invested in what plants and trees in particular can teach us and offer us in terms of medicine and healing. So it was really beautiful to read, and the way she describes and talks about plants and trees, it's lovely. I felt like I learnt a lot about trees, but also some of the history of Ireland and like why there's no trees in Ireland. I didn't even know that. It was super interesting. I won't say I loved this book. I think in part it didn't like, you know, capture me in the same way that, you know, 4 and 5 star books do. I really enjoyed it. For me, it was really quite soothing, and I found it hard to read a lot at a time because I'd like doze off a little bit. Not because it was boring, just because it was really relaxing and soothing. And I know some people in the book club like loved it, really loved it, and I could see why. It was lovely. Now for our 4-star books. Let's finish off talking about Punpun. So I gave 4 stars to Goodnight Punpun Volume 7. Again, a little bit tricky to talk about without kind of giving away all the previous volumes, but I will just say that the ending in particular, I thought like this volume is messed up. It's messed up, it's dark, it's sad, it's tragic, it's horrible. But the ending I thought was really, really well done, because I think it can be read many different ways. It depends on your perspective of the world and of Punpun, your interpretation of Punpun. And so I was feeling like a little bit confused by the ending at first, and then as I started kind of reading some reviews and stuff, I realized that that was sort of intentional, because some people were very adamant that it was a happy ending, and other people were like, this is the saddest thing I've ever read. So I think that was entirely intentional and done really cleverly. It was super clever. And even though I sort of slowed down reading Punpun for a while there because I wasn't enjoying it as much, now that I finished, I want to go back and reread it. So a good solid ending for Punpun. Then I had that same dream again. This was a sweet little book. It was a light novel. I originally bought it thinking it was manga, but it is not. I read this really quickly. I read it in like a day or two, and it was really quite sweet. Our protagonist and first person narrator is like a young girl. I don't think it's ever specified, but to me she reads like she's about 10. And in some ways it's sort of her figuring out, like, I don't know, not the meaning of life. That sounds a bit too grand. But it is really her trying to come to terms with her understanding of what happiness is and what that means for other people. She's a girl who's not super popular at school, but she has friends outside of school who she visits after school before she goes home. One is a teenage girl who's a few years older than her who engages in self-harm. Another is an adult woman who's super smart and who our protagonist really kind of puts up on a pedestal. And then the third is an older lady towards the end of her life. And I can't really say too much without giving... It has like an interesting sort of plot line that I don't want to give away. But I guess there's sort of like a hint of a mystical element to this that was really effective and I thought really beautiful. Because our protagonist really values intelligence, both in herself and in others, to the point where she sort of thinks she's better than everybody at school. And that's part of the reason why she doesn't have friends. And she's not too fussed about that at the beginning, but as we go through the book, she starts to sort of appreciate that people experience the world differently to her, and they have different values and different ways of going about expressing those values. And so through trying to better understand what happiness is, she learns more about herself and also develops a lot of empathy that she was lacking in the beginning. In some ways it's a small story, and in other ways it feels bigger than it is. So I really enjoyed it. It was super easy to read and it was just lovely, really touching. Then Jasper Jones by Craig Silvey. This was a book that I read in like 2 wild book boxes ago, but it bled over into the beginning of September. For me, there was some pretty significant flaws with this book. As I spoke about in the vlog, like one very obvious and significant thing was just like how constant the use of the R word was. I just hated that. It was unnecessary and it really took me out of the story. This is an Australian novel. I think it was set in the 60s, and our protagonist and first person narrator is Charlie, and I think he's a 13-year-old boy, although that was probably the other thing that bothered me about the book. He definitely is a lot smarter and wiser than a 13-year-old probably is. But anyway, he sort of gets involved in like this murder mystery with the local Aboriginal boy, Jasper. So essentially these two young boys are trying to figure out who murdered a young girl in their small town, because they know that because of the situation and the circumstances, Jasper will likely be accused even though he's innocent because he's Aboriginal. So the plot definitely revolves around like the mystery of what's happened to this young girl, but the story really is exploring themes of race in Australia, both as they regard Jasper and him being Aboriginal, but also Charlie's best friend is a Vietnamese boy. The writing in this was great. It felt so Australian, and I loved that Australian voice. The characters were super convincing, and the pacing was great. The mystery was enough to keep you invested, but it didn't like overshadow all of the other sort of discussion and themes that came through. It was really good. And then a book I read in the latest Wild Book Box vlog, that was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, and this was my very first Toni Morrison I've ever read, and I really liked it. This took me probably a little bit longer than most of these books to read. For me, it was the sort of thing that I wanted to read like 20 or 30 pages and then sort of just like sit with, because it was really uncomfortable. And that was intentional, but in order to kind of experience the book fully, I wanted to take my time with those emotions. And I think as a result, it was super impactful. So I'm glad I gave myself that space. This is a book in which like a lot happens, but also it's not really plot driven. It just sort of like follows a year in the life of this community and the different people in this community. And that is a largely black community in the, was it 1940s in America? And this book really explored the impacts of racism and the experience of racism within the community. The people in this book and the environment and everything, it just felt so harsh. Like all of these people, or most of them, having had really difficult experiences and upbringings and whatnot, it's almost like they become hard and harsh in order to survive that. And then in turn, they were sort of inflicting harm upon one another. It was difficult to read, and I guess essentially a lot of it was about that internalized racism, and that was very evident in our main character, Pecola, who is a young black girl who all she wished for was to have blue eyes. She's perceived as ugly and treated very poorly by the people around her, and she genuinely believes and wants blue eyes because she thinks that that will mean that she will be beautiful and people will love her. So that's such a small wish and want in a child. It's like heartbreaking, and it's kind of sickening too by the end. So I did not enjoy this book. That is not how I would describe my experience of it. It was unpleasant, it was uncomfortable, but the language and the writing was beautiful, and the way that these characters were positioned, it was really moving and heartbreaking. It was really well done. Now for our 4.5-star book. Again, from the Wild Book Box, this was Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo. I really enjoyed this book. I'm sure most people have heard of this book. It won the Booker Prize last year. It's a pretty big deal. And it is the story of 12 people, mostly women, mostly black. And it doesn't feel super plot driven. Instead, we sort of get 12 character profiles almost of 12 people who are all connected in some way. Some very obviously and closely connected, others are less obvious. But it is a book that explores race, class, gender, sexuality, a whole range of different identities, and these 12 people really do represent various intersectionalities of those identities. As I said in my vlog, sometimes this felt a little bit on the nose. Sometimes like you could really see that some of these characters almost felt like stereotypes of a particular lived experience or identity in order for Bernadine to sort of explore a particular idea. Like they felt like they serviced the book in a particular way. And sometimes the dialogue, especially around politics, it did sort of feel like the characters were like talking at you, the reader, as opposed to having a genuine dialogue with each other. So I guess it wasn't always as subtle as I might like. However, I loved reading it. I loved how we got such interesting pictures of such interesting people, and they were all so different. I loved how they all connected and how it kind of all really came together at the end. This also really made me think about like intergenerational differences, and especially what is considered progressive at one point in time later is very often considered, you know, quite conservative or backward thinking. And just gave me an appreciation for the fact that in 20, 30 years time, people are going to be thinking the same about the sort of like politics politics that I engaged in. And, you know, as we learn more about the world and ourselves and whatever, like politics isn't static, and the goals of people and groups isn't static. So I don't know, it just got me thinking about a lot, and I love it when a book can do that. And now for our 5-star books. The first one I'd like to talk about is the only audiobook I listened to in September, and that was The Death of Vivek OG by Akwaeke Emezi. And I will say the audiobook in particular, I'm really glad I listened to. This book is told from lots of different perspectives, and each of these chapters is narrated by a different actor in the audiobook, and they all just do such a good job. Osita in particular, whoever narrated Osita in the audiobook got me. That was the performance was brilliant. It was beautiful. This is a story set in Nigeria, and it is about two boys, Vivek and Osita, who are cousins, and they're very, very close as children. And as Vivek gets older, he's always been a little bit different, but as he gets older, he becomes more and more different, and he really starts exploring his gender identity and sexuality in ways that make the people around him very uncomfortable and very uncertain, and often worry about him. So really it is about these two people. They are the primary people that we're focused on throughout the story, but as I said, it is told from many different perspectives. And it was so interesting that this is not only a story about, you know, gender identity and sexuality and, you know, the relationship of these two cousins, but it was also so much about culture and even religion. A lot of the mothers in this story are immigrants to Nigeria. I think Vivek's mother was from India, somebody else's mother was from the Philippines, and so they have their own difficulties of sort of like assimilating into a culture that is quite different to their own. And then Osita's mother is, as the story progresses, she gets more and more into sort of like this really intense Christianity. Akwaeke Emezi's writing, even like the sex scenes in this, I want like a smut book from Akwaeke, because like it just... the sort of language that they use to describe things that, you know, I've read 100 times, sex scenes, right? It felt different. It felt new. It felt sensual and beautiful, but also like the rawness of sexuality still comes through, and the emotion that these people are experiencing through sex so much of the language and the way that Akwaeke Emezi writes, I'm really developing a strong appreciation for it now that I've read 2 books. The book is essentially sort of like leading up to the death of Vivek. So we know that Vivek dies, and this book mostly covers like the time period up until that point. And it is heartbreaking, and there's parts of this that are just like outright harrowing. There was a bunch of times where I felt angry, really upset, whatever with this book, and I think that's why it took me so long to listen to. Also because, you know, I'm in lockdown, so I'm not out like walking, which is when I normally listen to audiobooks. But either way, I absolutely relished the whole experience of listening to this book. It was beautiful in every sense of that word, and it was also just so moving and so powerful and so heartbreaking and tragic. It was all of the things that made me feel all of the feelings, and I loved it. And then this is not a border. This is one of the few non-fictions that I read this month, and it is an anthology, and all of the contributors are people who have participated in the Palestinian Festival of Literature. And all of these people talk to us about their experience traveling to Palestine for the festival, talk about the sort of things they saw there, heard there, experienced there, and then also a lot of them sort of then talk about on a larger scale connecting the experience of Palestine and what's happening there to, you know, similarities with apartheid in South Africa, because several of the contributors are from South Africa, and how basically all of them at the end come to an understanding that that is an appropriate word to use for the occupation of Palestine. I knew this was going to be a difficult book to read. I knew that going in, and it absolutely was. There's no getting around that. It's a beautiful mix of like just sort of people explaining their own experiences in Palestine to some really lovely poetry mixed in there as well. And as far as the people who have contributed, there's a huge variety there as well, with some people being from Palestine or having family from Palestine. And then others, like I said, being from South Africa. There were several people. There's someone who made a really incredible contribution who was from India, and they spoke about the similar sort of language around nationalism and like the allyship that Israel and India has had. And there was another contribution talking about like why the West, and maybe in particular Europe or the US, finds it so difficult to speak to the truth and reality of what's happening in Palestine, how that can be tied to our own sense of guilt as far as like colonialism is concerned, but then also the Holocaust, and how like this really tangled history makes honest communication and conversation around Israel and Palestine really, really difficult. But that ultimately the only people who are really losing from our inability or unwillingness to speak truth to the situation are Palestinians. So I don't very often actively recommend books. I will very often say that I loved it and maybe you will love it too. But there's some books that I just feel like are important and that I really think that more people should read. So if you have access to this, please do read it. But those are all of the books that I read in the month of September. Goodness, there was quite a few to go through. And even though, as I said at the beginning, the overall rating was a little lower, I don't feel like I didn't have a good reading month. This month was a really good one and I read some very moving and powerful books. The other cool thing about September is that I officially hit my Goodreads goal. I set my goal at 100 books this year, which is the most I've ever read by quite a long shot. But I've smashed it. I smashed it. Officially beat it midway through September, which is very cool. Yes, of course, the 16 short stories in the Timelord fairy tale series, that did help. But I would have beaten it this month or soon anyway. Point is, it's the first time I've ever read 100 books in a year, and I'm feeling pretty chuffed with myself. As always, I would like to thank my patrons over on Patreon for all of your support. I really do appreciate it, and a big extra special thank you goes to Tracy Timmerman, Laurie, Lynette Brown, and the Hales K. Thank you so much. I would love to hear how your reading month in September goes. Let me know if you had any standout books that you would recommend. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, so much love. Bye!